Wonderful, very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another episode of Perspective Learning Zone. And I am mentor Hamza Nasser, and today I'm going to be reviewing another of my one of my all-time favorite author Mitch Albom's books that I ended up liking a lot. So this book review is for the book by Mitch Albom called "The First Phone Call from Heaven." Now, first of all, what is the plot summary of The First Phone Call from Heaven? Attention, spoilers ahead, okay? So, rather, I should have said, alert, spoilers ahead, okay? So, The First Phone Call from Heaven by Mitch Albom, it actually tells the story of a small town, on Lake Michigan, whose residents start receiving phone calls from the afterlife. Now, as the novel opens, a girl called Tess Rafferty of Coldwater, Michigan, is shocked when she hears a voicemail left by her mother, who passed away from Alzheimer's years earlier. And Tess is the first person in town to report receiving a phone call from a dead relative. But she's certainly not alone. Now, soon people all over the town, they are reporting calls from their deceased family members. There's a police chief by the name of Jack Sellers who has received a phone call from his dead son, Robbie. The phone call, it stirs up a wealth of emotions in Jack as he struggles to make sense of it. He thinks about his wife, Doreen, who succumbed to depression after Robbie's death. He decides not to tell her about the phone call. At the same time, Catherine Yellen receives a phone call from her dead sister. So, and similarly, other people receive it. Now, there's a man called Sully Harding who is released from military prison, and he is met by his parents and his 7-year-old son, Jules. His wife, Giselle, has been in a coma and recently passed away. Sully goes to the funeral home to collect her ashes, overwhelmed by grief. And unsure what to do with his wife's ashes or how to move on with his life, Sully returns home with the urn and places it on his mantle. And in an attempt to get back to his feet, Sully moves into a new apartment and starts job hunting. He is soon confronted with the harsh realities of looking for work as an ex-convict. He finds that no one is willing to give him a chance. They simply can't see beyond his past. Jules, who had previously been living with Sully's parents, comes to live with him. And Sully is offered a job at a local newspaper selling ads. And although he hates the work, he knows he has to take what he can get. So when Catherine Yellen stands in front of the church congregation, talking about the phone calls that she has been receiving, it causes quite a stir. And Pastor Warren is at a loss as how to respond to the news. Now, he has never heard anything like it, not from any of the neighboring congregations. And he wonders if he should treat these miracles, if he should treat these occurrences as a miracle that the members of this church might have been chosen for a particular reason. So, the news spreads and people become all delusional about it. Sully makes it his mission to get to the bottom of this. And I won't tell you the remaining scenario, because obviously I don't want to spoil the surprise for those of you who want to give this book a try for themselves. But that being said and done, you sort of get the point what this whole book is about by now, my dear students. So, about my dear viewers. So, what is my review of this book, right? I feel like this book is written from an omniscient point of view, which is fitting for the topic. It's as if the author is looking down on the scene, right? He's describing the details of the event and telling about the characters involved, but without their personal emotion. There is a large cast, and Sully, for me, is probably the closest to a main character as you can get, but he doesn't really stand out much above the rest. I would definitely call this more of a plot-driven novel as opposed to a character-driven novel. However, this is not to say, my dear viewers, that there is no emotion involved. It may not come from character development, but it's impossible not to feel something when reading about the topic of death and afterlife, particularly when it challenges your mind and faith, which this book most certainly does. Having presented a medley of reactions to the phenomena, each with their own rationale, I believe this prevents this book, First Phone Call from Heaven, from being strictly a Christian novel. But it would have been interesting, I feel personally, to have some varieties of religious faiths being represented in the novel, like Judaism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Islam, and so on. So perhaps if the story had been set in a multicultural area of the world, it would be appealing to a larger readership. This book, it contains elements of the mystery genre as Sully tries to discover the origin of the phone calls while maintaining his composure. And his tragic past, it makes him a very compelling character, and the reader, whether a believer or not, is fully behind him in his quest for the truth. Now, my only real problem or reservation with the book, you can say, is that the characters are not very well developed or memorable, right? Although I read the bulk of this book in one sitting, I often had to, sort of scroll back, flick back the pages to remind myself who was whom. So, what I would say is that obviously it's not really a character based book. It's what you can say literary fiction, which means it does not fit in any genre, in any other genre. And despite my not really relating to any of the main characters, I found it difficult to put down what I had started. So the question comes in my mind when I was reading this book that were these people really hearing phone calls from heaven? If so, what was so special about this small town in Michigan where the phone calls were originating from? If they were all deluded, what was causing that delusion? Or was it some kind of elaborate hoax? If so, what was the purpose of that hoax? So the writing, well, definitely you gotta compliment the writing, which Albom nailed it as always. The writing is very good. It is terse, it is nicely paced, and it is often intriguing. There's a strong spiritual thread that is running through. And inevitably, ultimately, the local churches, they do become involved, and the general public starts believing in God Almighty and doing more to help other people. But the point is made that faith doesn't need proof, and that these phone calls are in some cases quite disturbing. People think they would give anything to hear from someone they love who is no longer with them, but maybe, just maybe, that is not such a good thing. Ultimately, the population of this town of not just of Michigan, but also of a much wider area, it makes national news. This population is divided and polarized. It's set in the United States where many people they see issues in a fashion that is very cut and dried, and there are no gray areas or even room for compromise or debate. So I did not really relate, personally speaking, I did not really relate to the passion or hysteria that drove people to drive hundreds of miles and camp out in the town. I assume this was meant to be light-hearted exaggeration, not but what I really liked was the way that the people of the town reached out to the visitors in the book, giving them food and shelter when possible, and not turning them away. Hence, paying homage to that saying, "Love thy neighbor." So, one of the coolest aspects is that interspersed within the chapter are interesting facts and tidbits about Alexander Graham Bell, which is an interesting tour down history lane for many of us who are unaware of these things. And we need to up our historic knowledge. I mean, there's that saying of Mark Borland that the decline in historic and civic knowledge is not only a failure of the education system, but it is a threat to the new generation itself. So there were some interesting facts and tidbits in this book about Alexander Graham Bell, about the invention of the telephone and other communication-related information. And combining this with a plot that is fresh, that is unique and relevant for today, I feel like Mitch Albom has crafted a powerful and page-turning tale. I spent the first three quarters actually wondering how in the world the story would play out, and the twist at the end was quite a pleasant surprise. How also, if you look in today's world where artificial intelligence has, evolved so quickly, there's something called a deep fake, in which through a video you can emulate someone else's expressions. You can quote someone as having said something, even though when that person has never said it, right? And if this deep fake video fully develops and materializes, it would be virtually impossible for us to admit video testimonies in code, which means that truth would virtually disappear from the face of the earth. So it does raise very interesting philosophical questions about the direction in which mainstream society is progressing. Have we progressed technology? Have we progressed technologically while aggressing or decaying or stagnating morally and spiritually speaking? This is an important question that I feel this book raised. And yeah, in conclusion, I would say, fellas, that despite the oddity of the premise, and the lack of clear main characters, I enjoyed this book very much. It's not one that I would necessarily want to repeat again, but it is certainly worth keeping on our bookshelves. I would recommend it to anyone who is looking for something a bit different and who does not mind a religious thread. I would not forget my favorite quote on this book, which came from Solly Harding, if I'm not mistaken, and he quotes, "You have to start over." That's what they say. But life is not a board game, and losing a loved one is never really starting over. It is more like continuing without, unquote. And I feel that is quite true. How many times do we always tell those who lost their loved ones, either through death or through circumstances, that they have to be strong and start over? I guess nobody, absolutely nobody on God's green earth is strong enough to admit the fact that we can still continue and move on even after a loss. So I would give this book a nice solid 7.5 out of 10. I would most definitely recommend it to the dear viewers and ladies and gentlemen listening to this video. So that's all for now, fellas. We'll be back with more reviews, with more enthralling content, God willing. Please don't hesitate to like, share, and subscribe to Perceptive Learning Zone. I will be back soon. Till then, stay blessed and keep rocking. God be with you all. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.